This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to a debate on Edward Snowden's decision to leak a trove of secret documents outlining the NSA's surveillance program. In an interview with the Guardian newspaper, Snowden described why he risked his career to leak the documents.
I think that the public is owed an explanation of the motivations behind the people who make these disclosures that are outside of the democratic model. When you are subverting the power of government, that's a fundamentally dangerous thing to democracy. And if you do that in secret consistently, as the government does when it wants to benefit from a secret action that it took, it'll kind of give its officials a mandate to go, hey, tell the press about this thing and that thing, so the public is on our side. But they rarely, if ever, do that when an abuse occurs. That falls to individual citizens, but they're typically maligned. It becomes a thing of these people are against the country, they're against the government. But I'm not. I'm no different from anybody else. I don't have special skills. I'm just another guy who sits there day to day in the office, watches what's happening, and goes, this is something that's not our place to decide. The public needs to decide whether these programs and policies are right or wrong. And I'm willing to go on the record to defend the authenticity of them and say, I didn't change these. I didn't modify the story. This is the truth. This is what's happening. You should decide whether we need to be doing this.
Edward Snowden's actions have elicited a range of reactions. Geoffrey of CNN and The New Yorker writes that Snowden is, quote, a grandiose narcissist who deserves to be in prison. Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, said that Snowden should not be considered a whistleblower because, quote, what he did was an act of treason. And Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina tweeted, I hope we follow Mr. Snowden to the ends of the earth to bring him to justice, language echoing what Senator Graham once said in the hunt for Osama bin Laden.
Meanwhile, Douglas Rushkoff wrote on CNN, quote, Snowden's a hero because he realized our very humanity was being compromised by the blind implementation of machines in the name of making us safe, unquote. The editor of the American Conservative, Scott McConnell, wrote, quote, if Obama wanted to do something smart, he should thank Snowden and offer him a job as a White House technology advisor. And Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg sang Snowden's praises, writing, quote, in my estimation, there has not been in American history a more important leak than Edward Snowden's release of NSA material, and that definitely includes the Pentagon Papers 40 years ago. For more, we host a debate on Edward Snowden. Is he a hero or a criminal, whistleblower or traitor? Here in New York, we're joined by Chris Hedges, senior fellow at the Nation Institute, was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times for 15 years, was part of a team of reporters that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for the paper's coverage of global terrorism, author, along with the cartoonist Joe Sacco of the New York Times bestseller Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. His most recent article is called The Judicial Lynching of Bradley Manning at truthdig.org. And in Chicago, Illinois, we're joined by Geoffrey Stone, a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. His recent piece for the Huffington Post is called Edward Snowden, Hero or Traitor. Stone served as an informal advisor to President Obama in 2008. In 1992, 20 years ago, Professor Stone hired Obama to teach constitutional law at the University of Chicago. Geoffrey Stone is also author of many books, including Top Secret, When Our Government Keeps Us in the Dark and Perilous Times, Free Speech in Wartime, from the Sedition Act of 1798 to the War on Terrorism. Chris Hedges, Geoffrey Stone, we welcome you both to Democracy Now! Professor Stone, I want to begin with you. In your piece, you say that Edward Snowden's actions were criminal. Can you explain why you feel he should be in jail?
Well, there is a federal statute that makes it a crime for public employees who have been granted access to classified information to reveal that information to persons who are unauthorized to receive it. So from a simple, straightforward, technical legal standpoint, there's absolutely no question that Snowden violated the law. And from that standpoint, if he's tried, he will be convicted, and he is, in fact, from that perspective, a criminal. Whether one admires what he did is another question, but it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not what he did was unlawful. The question of why I think he deserves punishment is he said it actually himself in the clip that you played earlier. He said, "I'm just an ordinary guy." Well, the fact is, he's just an ordinary guy with absolutely no expertise in public policy, in the law, in national security. He's a techie. He made the decision on his own, without any authorization, without any approval by the American people, to reveal classified information about which he had absolutely no expertise in terms of the danger to the nation, the value of the information to national security. That was a completely irresponsible and dangerous thing to do. Whether we think it was a positive thing in the long run or not is a separate question, but it was clearly criminal.
Chris Hedges, your response.
Well, what we're really having a debate about is whether or not we're going to have a free press left or not. If there are no Snowdens, if there are no Mannings, if there are no Assanges, there will be no free press. And if the press, and let's not forget that Snowden gave this to The Guardian. This was filtered through a press organization in the classic sort of way whistleblowers provide public information about unconstitutional criminal activity by their government to the public. So the notion that he's just some individual standing up and releasing stuff over the internet is false. But more importantly, what he has exposed essentially shows that anybody who reaches out to the press to expose fraud, crimes, unconstitutional activity, which this clearly appears to be, can be traced and shut down. And that's what's so frightening. So we are at a situation now, and I speak as a former investigative reporter for the New York Times, by which any investigation into the inner workings of government has become impossible. That's the real debate.
Well, Chris, how do you respond to the point that Geoffrey Stone made and how Snowden identified himself as an ordinary guy? Should any regular government employee or contractor be allowed to disclose whatever information he feels the public ought to be privy to, whether it's classified by the government and his employer or her employer or not?
Well, if that is what an act of conscience is, and reporters live our sort of daily fare is built, investigative reporters, off of people who within systems of power have a conscience to expose activities by the power elite which are criminal in origin or unconstitutional, and that's precisely what he did. And he did it in the traditional way, which was going to a journalist, Glenn Greenwald, and The Guardian, and having it vetted by that publication before it was put out to the public. Was it a criminal? Well, yes, but I suppose in a technical sense it was criminal, but set against the larger crime that is being committed by the state. When you have a system by which criminals are in power, criminals on Wall Street who are able to carry out massive fraud with no kinds of repercussions or serious regulation or investigation, criminals who torture in our black sites, criminals who carry out targeted assassinations, criminals who lie to the American public to prosecute preemptive war, which under international law is illegal. If you are a strict legalist, as apparently Professor Stone is, what you're in essence doing is protecting criminal activity. I would argue that in large sections of our government, it's the criminals who are in power.
Professor Stone, your response.
Well, first of all, there is, so far as I can tell from everything that's been revealed, absolutely nothing illegal or criminal about these programs. They may be terrible public policy, and I'm not sure I approve of them at all, but the fact is the claim that they're unconstitutional and illegal is wildly premature. Certainly from the standpoint of what's been released so far, whether Mr. Hedges likes it or not, or whether Mr. Snowden likes it or not, these are not unconstitutional or illegal programs.
Let me go to a letter that you co-signed, Professor Stone, in 2006 with other prominent attorneys about NSA surveillance under President Bush. You were criticizing it. You wrote, quote, "Although the program's secrecy prevents us from being privy to all of its details, the Justice Department's defense of what it concedes was secret and warrantless electronic surveillance of persons within the United States fails to identify any plausible legal authority for such surveillance. Accordingly, the program appears on its face to violate existing law." How do you compare that to what we're seeing today?
They're two completely different programs. The Bush NSA surveillance program was enacted in direct defiance of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The Obama program, if we want to call it that, was approved by Congress. That's number one. Number two is the Bush program involved wiretapping of the contents of phone conversations. The Supreme Court has long held that that is a violation of the Fourth Amendment if there's not an individualized determination of probable cause. The Obama program, if we want to call it that, does not involve wiretapping. It involves phone numbers. And the Supreme Court has long held that the government is allowed to obtain phone records, bank records, library records, purchase records, once you disclose that information to a third party. And there is no Fourth Amendment violation. So they're two completely different programs.
But if you just heard our conversation with the mathematician Susan Landau, she argued that often metadata is more revealing than the transcript of an actual conversation. Do you think the law should change, Geoffrey Stone, to include this metadata?
Well, I'm not persuaded by her argument that it's more revealing. I do believe that it's problematic, and I think in fact there should be statutes that prohibit the gathering of this type of data by private entities as well as by the government in the absence of at least a compelling justification. And I thought the Supreme Court's decisions initially on this question were wrong. So I would certainly want to see them differently. But in terms of what the law is, it's not unconstitutional, it's not illegal, and it's completely different from what the Bush administration was doing.
Chris Hedges, do you agree that...
Well, there are plenty of lawyers who disagree with Professor Stone.
Not many.
Well, the ACLU has just issued a lawsuit over this, claiming that it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So I haven't done a poll. Frankly, the legal profession, under this steady assault of civil liberties, can't hold its head very high. There are a few out there at the ACLU, Michael Ratner and a few others. But, you know...
Geoffrey Stone, aren't you on the board of the ACLU, or were you?
I'm on the National Advisory Council.
Yes. So what do you think of them suing the government over this?
I think it's great. I think that they are perfectly right to bring the question. That's their job. Their job is to challenge whether or not things are constitutional, to raise those questions. That's exactly what they should be doing. Doesn't mean they're always right, but they should be presenting these questions to the courts. That's their job. That's their responsibility.
Chris Hedges, one of the problems that people have pointed to is that there aren't procedures or mechanisms in place for people within the government to point out wrongdoing when it does occur. Do you think that's one of the problems that's occurred in this case with Edward Snowden, or for that matter, your most recent article was on Army whistleblower Private Bradley Manning?
Well, we used to have a mechanism. It was called the press. And we used to be able to tell our sources that they would be protected and that they would not be investigated for providing information that exposed the inner workings of power. Unfortunately, the press, like most institutions in this country, and I would add the legal profession, has largely collapsed under this corporate coup d'etat that's taken place and is no longer functioning. And I want to get back that what this is fundamentally a debate about is whether we are going to have, through the press, an independent institution within this country that can examine the inner workings of power or not. And it is now, I mean, many of us had suspected this widespread surveillance, but now that it's confirmed, we're seeing, you know, why did Snowden come out publicly? Well, because I think he knew that they would find out anyway, because they have all of Glenn Greenwald's email, phone records, and everything else. And they can very quickly find out who he was speaking to. And whether Snowden had contact with him. And that, you know, I speak as a reporter, is terrifying because it essentially shuts down any ability to counter the official propaganda and the official narrative and expose the crimes. And we have seen in the last few years tremendous crimes being committed by those in power. We have no ability now to investigate them.
Professor Stone, let me ask you about whether the reporters from The Guardian and The Washington Post should be prosecuted. CNN's Anderson Cooper put this question to Republican Congressmember Peter King of New York last night.
As far as reporters who help reveal these programs, do you believe something should happen to them? Do you believe they should be punished as well?
actually, if they willingly knew that this was classified information, I think action should be taken, especially on something of this magnitude. I know that the whole issue of leaks has been gone into over the last month, but I think something on this magnitude, there is an obligation, both moral but also legal, I believe, against the reporter disclosing something which would so severely compromise national security.
Professor Stone, your response to what Peter King is saying.